Hello, everyone. Welcome back. It's good to be with you guys again, as always. First of all, let me just start off today by saying thank you so much for all your hard work on the first essay assignment that you submitted last Thursday, comparing and contrasting the first two major religions in our course, Judaism and Christianity. I'm currently grading that stack of papers, and I will be done by the end of this week. As soon as I'm ready and I'm done with it, I will contact each student individually that submitted that essay to me, and I will return their score and comments so that you know exactly where you stand and how you did on that. Later this week, as we get a little bit closer to the weekend, I will also distribute the study guide for the midterm exam. And that midterm exam is going to be released to the class on Thursday, March 23rd. So you'll have some time to prepare for it. You can use the study guide to prepare and also to take part in the midterm review session, which I'm going to hold on Zoom on Tuesday, the 21st of March. And then, of course, after that review session that we have, I'll post it to Canvas so that everyone can see it and use it for their own study. Obviously, the more student participation that there is in the midterm review session, the better that would be. So I do hope that many of you guys will be able to join. I'll try to select certain hours that are, reasonable for probably most people, and we'll just see how many can arrive. But either way, I'll be holding the review session for the midterm on the 21st. You'll already have the study guide as of later this week, so you'll have it way in advance of that. Then I'll post that review session, and you'll be ready to go for your midterm exam on the 23rd. And before then, of course, as I was saying earlier, during this week, I'll be finishing grading your first essay and sending you back your score on that as well. The midterm exam is just going to be a set of short answer written questions, and you'll know exactly what possible topics and questions it could be because the study guide will just list all of the possible questions. And so you can just use it to sort of guide your review of the book, of the lectures, and just set yourself up for that successful exam. So those are just some upcoming dates and information to keep in mind for everybody. Again, thank you for your first essay, and like I said, I'll be done grading it by the end of this week, and I'll be in touch with each student individually on their score on that. Also, as always, I've said it before, but I'll repeat, just don't forget and don't fall too far behind on the journal entries that you guys should be doing. Send yours to me at any time, whenever you got them. To do that, again, you simply can email me the attached file at, here's my email address. Putting it in the chat, rvulich, R-V-U-L-I-C-H, at occ.cccb.edu. See, email is more secure, in my opinion, than Canvas. That's why I do like to receive the assignments that way, although I would also be willing to accept it through Canvas Inbox. If you're looking for Canvas Inbox, you would definitely be able to find it if you just go to the Canvas page for our course and you look at the left column on the far left of your screen. You'll see underneath Account, Dashboard, Courses, Calendar, the fourth button is Inbox. When you click on that, it would take you to the interface where you can simply send a message by starting to type in the name of me, the member of the class that you'd like to reach through Inbox. But anyway, you can email it. That's my preferred format, or you can simply send it to Canvas. Either way, though, just try to stay up on the course, and I'll be in touch with you, and I can help you with anything that you need. If you ever have questions or any other concerns, please email me or contact me in whatever way, and I'll be able to return your message in a short time frame. So anyway then, guys, with those administrative issues behind us, we're going to return now to our lecture series. Today is a key meeting because we're going to finish our 3-lecture unit on the major world religion of Islam. This is the third and final lecture in that topic. So it's Islam Part 3 today. Okay, Islam Part 3. That's our goal for the day. So just some brief points of summary, what we've already learned and talked about. We learned about the historical origins and the development of Islam, starting with the visions and revelations of the Prophet Muhammad in 610 in the Arabian town of Mecca. From the cave overlooking Mount Hira, he started to see prophetic visions from the angel Gabriel which form the basis of the Quran and the revelations that basically generate the text and scriptures of the religion. Then, of course, another notable event in the early history of Islam is the Hijra, the migration and journey of Muhammad and some of his followers from Mecca to Medina. That's in the year 622, and that is the start of the Islamic calendar. From there, we talked about the expansion of the Islamic Empire, both under the control and rule of Muhammad, and then later, after he died in 632, successors of Muhammad became leaders of the religion and growing governmental body and structure. We talked about sacred persons, of course, the Prophet himself, his family, his successors, and at least relative to Shia belief, the lineage of imams that is supposed to be figureheads of the religion going forward after him. We talked about sacred times, the calendar of the Islamic calendar, the holy month of Ramadan, where people are to fast during daytime hours, the pillar of Islam known as the Hajj, which is the expected ritual of making a religious journey to Mecca and circumambulating the Kaaba, which is a central shrine in the middle of Mecca. We talked about the required sacred prayers of each day, 5 prayers, the 5 pillars of Islam that are expected benchmarks of religious practice and faith. We talked about Islamic views of God, most essentially the principle known as Tawheed, which basically translates to the unity of God, the oneness of God, that God is utterly one and not to be associated with any other thing aside from himself. And that in Islam, the word itself basically means something akin to submission and peace. So it's like a peaceful surrender to the will of God and to be obedient to God, which in turn leaves the individual with peace and the potential for God's favor. We talked about the ethical doctrines of Islam and the law that can be derived from the sacred texts of the Quran and the Hadith. And we also talked about the different branches of Islam. Just as there's Catholic and Protestant in Christianity, there's Sunni and Shia, Sunni being the majority branch, Shia being a more minority branch, but still a significant number of Shia Muslims. We talked about further divisions within the Shia branch of the Twelvers, who think that the 12th Imam is a hidden Imam that still lives to this day and will return towards the Day of Judgment. And then the Ismaili Shias, who think that there's an unbroken line of Imams that continues on to the current day. And we also briefly talked about the concept of Sufi mystics within Islam, who practice something similar to Eastern meditative practices of chanting and meditation to achieve spiritual knowledge and a sense of inner peace. So with all those kind of points, just a review now covered, we're going to talk about our plan today. The plan today is to discuss 2 major areas from Coogan's book to finish out his chapter. We will discuss Islamic views concerning death and the afterlife. So I'm just putting this here, topics for today. So one of them is death and the afterlife. And then the other one is society and religion. Okay, 2 major points of focus for the beginning part of the lecture. Islamic views on death and the afterlife, as well as the relation of modern society over the past, say, 125 years and Islam. And after that, we'll finish by taking a quick look at Smith's discussion of Islam, Huston Smith, the secondary author and a textbook in our class. As seen in our course of secondary text, we'll look at some of his information. And then to keep your mind on the schedule, once this lecture is done, the next one that comes forward for the Thursday of the March 9th date is going to begin the next major religion that we will cover, and that's Hinduism, the religion of India and Indian subcontinent. although not limited to the Indian subcontinent, but that's its historical base. At any rate, we'll have 3 lectures on that as we start to turn our attention towards the midterm after that unit of the course is finished. But for now, anyway, first things first, let's resume, beginning with our views, or the views of Islam about death and the afterlife. Okay, so death and the afterlife. Islam has a lot of similarities to Christianity in certain respects on this point, because much like Christianity, Islam affirms that in death, the person returns to God, the Creator. This is mentioned in the scriptures of Islam, in the Quran. You can see it written in the Surah 21, Ayah 35, which is placed on page 118 of our Coogan textbook. It says there, every soul must taste of death. We test and try you with the evil and with the good. To us you will return. Us there being used in the sort of plural sense, but it's referring to the singular God, not unlike the royal we that is sometimes used by people of nobility and so forth. So everyone returns back to God after death, according to the doctrine. It is seen in Islam that the life that God grants to the person is given by his grace and is sort of comparable to a gift, a gratuity that the person is, supposed to honor and respect and cherish. So given by his grace, the person is granted life, and therefore God retains the power and the authority to ultimately have what he has created come back to him on the final day of judgment. The soul, they say, escapes from the confines of the earthly body and then goes up into the afterlife. The doctrines of the immortal soul and afterlife are therefore central to Islam. It's a key element of religious belief within this practice, to have the standing belief that there is a soul and that there is an afterlife, that the soul will be judged by God on a final day of judgment. In the view of Islam, only through the Quran is man able to know about the afterlife. God provides knowledge of the afterlife through the scripture, through his revelation, and that's, according to this view, how you should consider the outcomes that are looming ahead in the afterlife for a human being. So for a Muslim, it is a central doctrine that is to believe in God and his awesome presence, and part of that is to believe in the afterlife and the day of judgment. So this is a feature of Islam that is in some sense similar to Christianity. Islam, like Christianity, says that each soul will be judged, but also that all souls will be judged in an apocalyptic final judgment. The process that the individual goes through in death, according to the religion, is described in vivid detail within the tradition. So I'll just try to type out the various steps in the process of the afterlife. So step 1, it's just the body stops functioning, so that's death itself. Okay, so this gets concept or process of what happens in the afterlife started. Of course, one dies, and then the second step is that the soul releases the body, or sorry, the body releases the soul. Thank you. Okay, so body stops functioning, the soul is released. The soul is then examined by 2 of God's angels. Of God's angels, sometimes claimed to be the angel Gabriel and Azrael, who's known as the angel of death in Islam. After that examination happens, from there the soul remains in the grave until the end of the world. Okay, and then finally, at the end of the world, all mankind is resurrected to face final judgment. Okay, and there you see the basic process according to how it's described in these holy texts. God, they say, judges each person according to their obedience to God and their degree of fidelity to the Quran and the Hadith. The non-believer, they say, is cast into hell, and the true believer goes into paradise. So there's this basic idea of heaven and hell, just as you see in the Christian tradition. The Quran very strongly emphasizes the rewards and punishments of heaven and hell throughout the text, constantly evokes very powerful and detailed representations of each. The believer, therefore, throughout the whole scripture, is constantly being forewarned of the horrors of hell in the Quran and the limitless joys of paradise by contrast. The way that a person is to gain paradise, I mean, I know we've said that it involves submission and obedience to God and following the Quran and Hadith. There's another phrase that's sometimes used in Islam to describe this method by which you can attain paradise and heaven. And it's sometimes called walking the straight path or taking the straight path. So this is just a notable phrase in religious discussion within Islam. Islamic scholars looking at these holy texts derive this message from it, that one should walk the straight path. And how is that done? You walk the straight path, they say, when you remain truly devoted to the religion and you never stray or veer or deviate very far from its principles and from its scripture. Those that lose salvation stray from the straight path, you know, like almost as if a metaphor of a person wandering off of the path as they go along their journey. But the true believer stays fast to the straight path, doesn't veer off, and that's the surest and most direct route to achieve the heavenly paradise. This is written about in the Quran on page 119 of our book, from Surah 19, Ayah 36. And there it says, "Surely God is my Lord and your Lord, so worship and serve him. This is the straight path." At final judgment, they say the path becomes more narrow. So only those that are walking the straightest along the path can stay along it, but those that veer off or deviate somewhat because the path has gone too narrow now, they'll fall off, and that means they'll be in hell. There's a term for Satan, the devil in Islam, which is Iblis. Okay, and Iblis is a lot like the character of Lucifer from the Bible in Christianity. So originally he's said to have been an angel that was very devout to God. But then when God created Adam, he defied God, because God, according to the story, told all the angels to bow down and prostrate themselves before Adam, the first man that God had created. But Iblis, being an angel, was too prideful to do that, and he refused to prostrate before Adam. And that, was not in line with God's will. So God therefore cast him out into hell. And ever since, he's been dedicated to corrupting human beings and corrupting mankind. Now, one other thing to mention as we talk about the concept of heaven and hell and the afterlife in Islam is something that we talked about earlier as we were discussing Judaism, and maybe in some lesser respect in Christianity, that it's a little mysterious, you might say, philosophically, how one can be morally responsible for the deeds of their life if everything is predestined, since God, they say, is omnipotent and omniscient. If God knows everything that will happen, if God preordains all facts, then you'd think you don't have the ability, therefore, to be doing anything other than what you in fact do, since it's all governed by the will of God and everything happens according to his will. So how then can a person be fairly rewarded or punished if they're predestined to either walk the straight path or not? Islamic scholars, just like Jewish and Christian theologians, have long grappled with this apparent tension, the tension between the necessity for moral responsibility and judgment of human beings, but also the doctrine that God retains all power and therefore has foreknowledge of all things that would happen. As again, to remind you, if one is predestined to either be on the straight path or straying from it, then you might wonder how the judgment in the end can really be fair. You'd think we would have to be free in order for the conduct of our lives to be something that we can be judged on. One scholar who tried to grapple with this in the Islamic tradition is al-Ash'ari, who died in 935 ACE. Right, and so he tried to reconcile this tension by saying that God, although he is omnipotent, gives man a modicum of freedom, or some describe it as a brief moment of freedom. That's interestingly similar to the doctrine of, you remember, Tzimtzum in Judaism, which also tried to thread this needle by saying that God, though he has unlimited power, engages in a degree of self-limitation with respect to humans so that they can be issued free will and therefore be judged on their conduct. But anyway, that's just a philosophical puzzle and issue for anybody to think about, regardless, I guess, of the nature of your religious belief, because most all religions do say that God has unlimited power and knowledge, which does, at least on the surface, present some difficulties in articulating how people may be morally judged on their conduct. But anyway, now I guess we've discussed death and the afterlife according to the religion. So we're going to move on to the last section of Coogan's chapter on Islam, which is the relationship of society to Islam, especially in the past modern period of 150 years or so. So in the past century, Western imperialism, Western culture, Western cultural influence and technology, and the rise of secularism have all had an effect on Islam and generated different reactions from members of the religion. Turkey, for example, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire and after the World War I, went in the direction of being a modern secular state. Just so we're all clear on the use of this word that I've mentioned a few times, secular. It just means not religiously affiliated. So yeah, like we have, for example, a secular government, although most people believe in one version of religion or another in our country. We don't have laws instituted by churches or by religious councils. We have a secular government where public policy and law is decided on a non-religious basis. And in Turkey, for example, that is the nature of their society, even though it is a majority Muslim country. We can look to the efforts of this man as the founder of the modern Turkish state. So I'm just going to give you his information. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. And he lived from 1881 to 1938. He's the founder of modern Turkey. Yeah, and so the modern Turkish state, a secular Islamic majority country, I shouldn't say Islamic, I guess, that has other connotations, but it is a majority Muslim country, and he's the founder of the modern state of Turkey. He separated Islamic religious law and practices from government and public policy, but not every majority Muslim country took the same reformist direction in view of the pressures of modernism. In Iran, there was an attempt to do this. The Shahs created from 1925 to 1979 a similar secular government. So okay, so I just put a little note there in our chat window that the Shahs ruled over a secular Iran from 1925 to 1979. At that time, it looked as if Iran would be another one of these secular Muslim countries. But in 1979, it was overthrown in a theocratic revolution that did make it into a theocratic state under the leadership of Ayatollah Khomeini. Many prominent Muslim scholars advocated for a middle ground where there would be a modern state, but yet with Islamic principles lying at the heart of its government and policies. But there has been and there continues to be a tension between the more conservative religious traditionalists and reformers that would like to modernize and secularize the societies that people live in. And that tension between conservative religious tradition and reform movements is just as much a part of Islam as we saw in both Judaism and Christianity to some extent. Since Islam is, according to studies that have been conducted, the world's fastest growing religion, it's gaining members faster than any other major religion, it continues to encounter new cultures as it spreads to the world, and therefore, in many cases, has to accommodate to these new cultures. To the more fundamentalist Muslim, the solution to the problems of the clash between modernity and the strict application of Islamic doctrines would simply be to follow Islam, to make no compromise. Ironically, though, the political and the highly authoritarian nature of the fundamentalist view of society is not really rooted very deeply in Islam's own history, which if you go through it, you'll actually see it was always very intellectually vibrant and tolerant of individualism and even diversity. We can never forget that extremists, for example, who cite religion as justification for their militarism or for their political goals, should be seen not in an exclusively religious, but also a socio-political context. Much of that political context comes from the interactions of Western imperial power in the last 125 years with Islam and the rise of secular states in the Islamic world. The fundamentalists, the sort of traditionalist, purist of the religion, would claim that Islamic society and practices are being corrupted by the influence of Western culture, which they see as morally weak and impure. For example, things like having a more public role for women could be seen by fundamentalists as contrary to certain literal interpretations of Quran doctrines or to God's will. To radicals who follow that way of thinking, there should be a purely Islamic state that's governed strictly by the Sharia law. There's at least one influential writer to name who argued for the establishment of a more traditional theocratic Islamic state and also issued harsh critiques of reformers in Islam and also of the West. And this man is Sayyid Qutb, who died in 1966. Qutb wrote a lot of, scholarly Islamic literature and essays calling for revolutionary change and for a return to a more purely Islamic society and way of life. And that body of writings inspired a lot of other fundamentalists and radicals too. I'm sure many of you have seen or heard about the veil that some conservative traditional Muslim women would wear. The word for that is hijab. Hijab. Why is the hijab worn? It's to appear modest, to be humble and unassuming. It's considered a traditional role of women not to present in an ostentatious way, at least in traditional views of Islam. We've seen that there are sometimes, not egalitarian gender norms, at least in other of the traditional world religions as well. In Judaism, women were not supposed to have gone to certain sections of synagogue or a temple. And anyway, it's not a unique feature of traditional interpretations of one world religion, but it's certainly something that can be seen in various areas of Islamic practice. It's just one example of the role of women in Islam. More reformist and Western Muslim women often do not wear the hijab, but it also depends on which country that one is in. In more fundamentalist Muslim societies, where stricter application of Islamic doctrine is part of the law, places like Iran or Saudi Arabia, it could be a violation for a woman to remove the veil in public. And also in other cases, they may not be allowed to do things that men are able to do in society, whether that's vote or drive. But in other Islamic societies that are more secular and modern, women are fully equal, and there's no such expectation to wear, for example, the hijab in places like, say, Turkey or Indonesia or what have you. There's been a longstanding effort, I should say, rather, there's been a longstanding conflict between Palestinian Muslims and Israeli Jews. And this is just another thing to mention as we're talking about the social fabric that we're living in and seeing in the world today and how it relates to Islam. Ever since modern Israel was established in 1948, when that happened, Jews settling in the area led to mass uprooting of many Muslims from existing Palestinian homes and properties. So that sets the tone for a tense coexistence in the next generations to follow after modern Israel was established. Jerusalem, for example, is considered to be of great religious significance to all three of the Abrahamic religions. In Islam, it is claimed that Jerusalem is where Muhammad went with the angel Gabriel on the Isra, which is this like mythical or legendary journey up into heaven, guided by angels, communicating with God, which sets the terms of the daily prayer at 5, and also according to which he talked to other prophets in the lineage of prophets like Jesus and Abraham. So it's also, of course, important to Jews, seeing it as part of Israel, the Holy Land, and to Christians where Jesus had significant time spent there preaching and practicing. So because they all claim some type of deep historical religious importance to the region, it's kind of like this social hot potato where everyone wants to claim greater identity with it, and that creates tension. Israel captured East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip in the Arab-Israeli War of 1967, and that's a defeat for the Muslims that were living in those areas at the time that had been displaced. That defeat, some fundamentalist Muslim scholars blamed in part on weak Arab regimes that gave in to the West and made too many concessions to the rise of secular nationalism. And that's why in some of those circles, this is seen as a justification for calls to be more militant. Israel, to this day, has sometimes harsh security operations that they perform in the occupied territories on the Gaza Strip and in Palestine, oftentimes under the premise that they're being threatened by militants, like, for example, organization known as Hamas in the Palestinian territory. But the harsh security operations sometimes are imprecise, and sometimes indiscriminately people are harmed that don't have any affiliation with either terrorism or with extremism. And because of that, it kind of fuels a cycle of violence on both sides that continues to this day, a cycle of retribution and reprisals for the perceived injustices of military or state aggression against a group of people. So that's something that we see continuing to play out. Surely the Israeli-Palestinian conflict over there is by no means resolved, but we look for a peace plan and some kind of movement towards a better status quo as we continue going through this 21st century. So that kind of wraps up our notes on Coogan's review of Islam. The main text of our book, Michael Coogan, Illustrated Guide to World Religions. Aside from that, I wanted us to spend a little bit of time, the rest of our time today, just taking a quick look at Huston Smith's discussion of Islam from our secondary text called The World's Religions. So some of this will just kind of cover some familiar ground in reporting in its own way on things that we heard from Coogan's book. But there's some interesting insights and some different observations that he has. So I do want to add that to our notes. Okay. So Smith gives his own description of the life of the Prophet Muhammad. He was born in 570 ACE into Mecca, a Mecca that was socially disorganized at the time and practicing a kind of crude form of polytheism. His father died a few days before he was born. His mom died when he was 6 years old. And then he was being taken care of by his grandfather, but his grandfather died when he was 8 years old, so he kind of was an orphan. After that, he was adopted by his uncle. He had a reputation for just being a good person, a hard worker, a very honest human being. He worked very hard tending to his uncle's farm, and he was treated well in his uncle's care. He was known to his family at the time as a pure of heart person, like had a pure heart, that he was honest and trustworthy. When he became an adult, he worked with merchant caravans, and at the age of 25, he met a wealthy older widower named Khadija. I think I've mentioned her before, but I'll say her name again. Yeah. Now, so she was his first wife, and he's 25 when he met her, and she was 40, so she's a little older than him. She stayed at his side and gave him comfort, even when no one else would believe in him or in his revelations. He began to frequent the cave on Mount Hira, going there to try and just achieve solitude and also in a quest for spiritual knowledge. Just look at my notes here. One night there at that cave in the year 610, the angel Gabriel, according to tradition, appears to Muhammad. And he says the first surah that, well, it's not the first surah in the Quran, but it's claimed to be the first surah revealed to the Prophet. And it's the blood clot, Surah 96, ayat 1 through 3. And the full text of it, which is written on page 226 of our Houston Smith textbook, says, "Proclaim in the name of your Lord who created man from a clot of blood. Proclaim, your Lord is the most generous, who teaches by the pen, teaches man what he knew not." And that's supposed to be the first words of revelation given unto Muhammad by the angel Gabriel. At first he was overcome, wondered if he was losing his mind. He told Khadija, and she became his first convert. She encouraged him to spread the prophecy and to spread this revelation and message of monotheism that he was hearing. Even when he wasn't sure if this was true and accurate, sorry, she reassured him. Take a little sip of water. Thank you, guys. She reassured him. From there, he saw it as his entire purpose in life to spread the message he was hearing from God and to spread these revelations to gain as many different followers to this position as possible, because he thought of it as a mandate given to him from God. Not to enlarge or to glorify himself, not to seek his own advantage or benefit, but merely to glorify and do the bidding of God. Now, God in Arabic is known as Allah. And you may wonder, where does the word derive from? So the word Allah is just straightforward translation in our English as God. But if you go back to the Arabic, it's interesting because there's two derived roots. So first is al, which is just the definite article, which means it's the word the. Okay, so the first part of it means the or the. And the last part comes from the word ilah, I-L-A-H, and that means God. So maybe I got to make one slight change here. I'm going to remove one note because it's not quite fair, or well, not about fairness, but it's not quite accurate to say that Allah means God. It actually means the God, because it's a combination of two root words, al meaning the, and ilah, which means God. So it's the God, the God. In translation, it literally means the God, not a God. And that's kind of important because it reinforces the message of monotheism that's like the crux of the religion, that there's only one God, not just a God, but the God. One of my favorite restaurants that I still go to a lot over in Lawndale, kind of close to where I grew up in Redondo Beach, is called Al Nur. Nur means light, so that restaurant's called The Light, if you were to translate it into English. But at any rate, knowing that the word al means the will give you a sense of how to at least understand the first part of some Islamic phrases in Arabic. So just an interesting fact about the origins of the term Allah. It means the God, al, the, ilah, God. The surrounding Meccan community that Muhammad was in was hostile to his message, and they were hostile for a few reasons. So okay, so I'm putting down reasons that the Meccan community was originally hostile to Muhammad's message. Number one, um, because it threatened polytheism, which was the prevailing belief system at the time. In Islam, there's no other God but God. And so, to those that were polytheists, this was a challenge and a threat to their belief system and way of living. It also demanded moral purity of people. And, people sometimes don't like to be called out for transgressions related to their moral conduct. So, that's another factor that made it something that people were opposed to in some circles in Mecca at the time. And also, another reason that it was greeted with hostility by some is that it challenged an unjust social order. Because in Islam, everyone is equal before God. Everyone is just God's subject, whether it be the most noble king in the highest circles of society to the lowliest peasant. All are equal before God. All are judged the same before God. And that also, was something that not everyone agreed with, because they might have preferred to think that there is some kind of social hierarchy according to which some people are accorded more benefits or respect in society than others. So, because of this hostility to the message that he was trying to spread, he was getting a lot of followers, and the ranks of his followers were expanding. But there was also a lot of persecution, just as we saw in the early generations of the Christians, how they were persecuted under Roman control, and also how Jews were persecuted and exiled throughout much of their history. In the early era of Muhammad's preaching, they were certainly persecuted. And as it says here in Smith's book, so when words failed, they resorted to open persecution. They covered Muhammad and his followers with dirt and filth as they were praying. They pelted them with stones, beat them with sticks, threw them in prison, tried to starve them by refusing to sell to them. And did this work? Obviously not. It's become one of the biggest world religions. But you can also argue that these attempts to crush the religion through persecution actually just strengthened it and steadied the resolve of those that were true believers to it. I think in the same way, the early persecution of Christians probably steadied their resolve and made their belief in the movement stronger and more faithful. And perhaps something similar in the persecution and exile of Jews gave them the right premise to preserve their religion and to record it down in written form so that it would last despite being in a diaspora. So anyway, as his movement continues to build, he finally makes the journey of the Hijra in 622, as we've said. Once there, he becomes a political and military leader. The military campaigns that he was leading his men on and his followers on in these early years were quite impressive, because sometimes they were defeating a much larger army or enemy. And with each military conquest or victory, the faithful became more certain that God was on their side and that they were doing God's work, because they thought, how could we think otherwise if we're having all this military success and success and expansion, if not for God's grace and his beneficence, as he favors us doing that. When Muhammad died in the year 632, almost all of the Arabian Peninsula was under his control. Before the end of the century, that is by the year of 700 ACE, Islam had conquered so much land and territory, as it's written here on page 230. It says, 2 years later, in 632, or according to the Islamic calendar, 10 AH after the Hijra. So just as you remember, the Islamic calendar starts in the year 622, dated towards the Hijra. But anyway, in 632, Muhammad died with virtually all of Arabia under his control. With all the power of armies and police, no other Arab had ever succeeded in uniting his countrymen as he had. Before the century closed, his followers had conquered Armenia, Persia, Syria, Palestine, Iraq, North Africa, and Spain, and had crossed the Pyrenees into France. They were defeated in the Battle of Tours in 733, but if not for that, the entire Western world today might be more Muslim than it is. Now, the Quran derived from Muhammad's revelations, and it's supposed to be a continuation of the Old and the New Testament, the earlier scriptures of both Judaism and Christianity. It is considered by Muslims to be the final revelation that follows after those others, and the last revelation. Since it is the last, they claim that it's the culmination of all of God's revelations to man and that it's perfected, whereas the others had some imperfections. Reading here on page 233, you can see verses in the Quran that express this idea that the other two holy scriptures from Judaism and Christianity are considered religiously authoritative and are given respect. It says, "We made a covenant of old with the children of Israel, and you have nothing of guidance until you observe the Torah and the gospel." That's kind of a mashup of Surah 5, Ayah 70, and Surah 5, Ayah 68. But the full version of them I could read here. "Say, people of the book, you have no true basis for your religion unless you uphold the Torah, the gospel, and that which has been sent down to you from your Lord. But what has been sent down to the prophet from your Lord is sure to increase many of them in their insolence and defiance. Do not worry about those who defy God." So you hear it written in the Quran there that there is respect and deference that is due to the Torah and to the Gospels, even though they do say that the Quran is the perfected version of God's revelation to man and therefore has pride of place over and above them. As mentioned before, this is why the Quran shows respect for the other two religions as quote-unquote people of the book. The writing of the Quran, just the style of the writing, it's very direct. It reads like imperatives, commands that are given directly from God to the reader. It's not as much focused on events as you would see in, like, say, stories and parables of the Old and New Testament. It does record and recount certain significant events, but it's more focused on pronouncements, declarations, rules. It's very striking, it's evocative, it's spare in its quality, and it's unfiltered. Now, just a few more points from the analysis of Smith. I hope you guys are doing well and been able to follow me so far. Islam's central religious principle is Tawheed, that God is one. Tawheed, the oneness of God. This is like a central doctrine of Islam. He's one. He's unmixed with anything else. He's not to be associated with anything. To Muslims, Judaism saw this in their Shema prayer, which does say, let me try to find the passage. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." But they think that the Christian belief kind of deviates from this to some extent by associating God with Christ. And in Islam, God is to be not associated with anything, and certainly nothing human or of the world. God in Islam is depicted as awesome and so powerful, so much so that he can inspire both respect, submission, and fear. Islam says that God created all things, but his most important and special creation is man. In Christianity, it is argued that man is fallen from original sin, the original sin of Adam, but Muslims don't believe that man is in a fallen condition. The closest they have to the concept of being fallen is the term ghafla, which means forgetting. So here is one other concept from Islam. Forgetting is its closest translation. And what that refers to is that a human being sometimes or somehow forgets their connection to God, the obligations they have under God, and the divine link that they have to God. So it's the job of the Quran and Islam to stop people from being in the state of forgetfulness so that they can attend to their true religious and moral obligations as God wants. But nonetheless, even though we have sometimes forgotten these things according to that tradition, Islam still sees the nature of man as basically good. So there's not the same degree of like guilt and labeling as a so-called sinner. One can have essential self-respect and a good self-image. Sorry. In the religion, all one has to do to win God's favor is to be grateful for the life that you've been given by Him. Sorry for the cough, okay. And to submit to Him peacefully and to His laws and pronouncements. Those that don't are repeatedly reminded in the Quran that they will be judged accordingly. Smith, after that, basically just discusses the 5 pillars of Islam that we covered in the last lecture. And one last point that I will note in his writing is how he mentions that, unlike in the Christian tradition, there's no Islamic idea equivalent to turning the other cheek to one's aggressors. Famously in the New Testament, Jesus says this at one point. He says, if you are smited on the cheek, don't return the strike to your opponent or your enemy, but rather turn the other cheek, offering up the other one as a secondary place for them to strike, showing your pacifism and your unwillingness to take vengeance, because vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, in the Christian tradition. But in Islam, this idea of pacifistic refusal to return a wrong is not seen. Instead, Islam allows punishment of those that do wrong to the full extent of the harm that they caused. And reciprocity in punishment is often emphasized rather than de-emphasized. This is seen as fair play and as an aspect of God's righteous justice. So there's a little bit more of a retributive eye for an eye quality to the to the enforcement of law and to the accountability for wrongdoers and evildoers in the religion. Okay, so for that, everybody, I've pretty much taken on all the notes that I wanted to cover for you guys on this religion. It sometimes happens that the third of the 3-lecture unit on each religion is a bit shorter in duration because I may have covered much of the notes in the first 2. But we're getting close to 53 minutes or so, and that's enough time, I think, for today's meeting. So I'm going to post this just now, and I'm sure, I mean, if you're watching it, then you know it's been posted. But at any rate, have a great one. Be in touch with me if you need anything at all. Like I've said before, I'll post our first lecture on Hinduism in a few days, and that'll be scheduled for Thursday, March 9th, the viewing date of that. And then we'll have 2 more lectures to follow after that, 3 in total on Hinduism. I'll be returning back your scores on the first essay this week. I'll be posting the study guide for the midterm exam later in this week as well. And we'll just continue moving through the course in the same order that you see listed in our syllabus. So I really appreciate you guys tuning in. I want you to stay focused on the class. Make sure that you're turning in your work to me. I know some of you had a hard time getting some of the work done so far, but you still have a good opportunity to do well, or at least to pass, but you have to submit work. Anyways, thanks so much, everybody, and have a great one. Wherever you're at, I'm wishing you well. And this is just Dr. Vulich signing off for today, and I'll see you soon. Okay, thanks.